Hello everyone, this is Dr. Catalana. The purpose of this presentation is to provide students with an overview of Artifact 4, the informative feedback chart for our EDCO 220 assessment course. Now, a couple of disclaimers before I get going. First, I am recording this in the midst of the COVID craziness, so I do apologize for any background noise. And second, I want to emphasize that the examples I'm going to walk through are not perfect examples, and I do this on purpose. Artifact 4 is meant to be messy. In fact, we have designed it to help students recognize potential issues in the assessments that they chose for Artifacts 2 and 3. Now that's totally fine. We are not grading you on having perfect assessments or even on creating a perfect feedback chart. More importantly, we are grading you on the analysis of these artifacts and the application of these materials, such as purpose of assessment and appropriate feedback to your future classroom. So I just want to give a disclaimer for my students who may be a little stressed about having the perfect sample assessments or the perfect informative feedback chart. That's not the purpose of this assessment. The purpose of the artifact analysis is for you to critically analyze sample artifacts that you could use in your future classroom. In fact, if they do have issues, it may make your life easier because you have more to analyze when you're writing up your report. So with that being said, the purpose of today is to really focus on Artifact 4, which is your informative feedback chart. To give you a little bit of context, this is probably the template or close to the template that you have seen. We will be focusing in this presentation on the chart. I did want to just show you the main directions for this chart. So the purpose of this artifact is for you to take one of your assessments from Artifact 2 or 3, which were those two sample assessments you found that could have different purposes in the classroom, whether they be diagnostic, formative, or summative. The purpose here is choose one of those assessments and aligned learning objective or standard that you already have, and now start to think hypothetically, how might your students do on this assessment, and then how would you respond to their performance? So the overall gist of what we're looking for is for you to consider how you would group students into groups of below expectations, approaching expectations, and finally meets or exceeds expectations, and then what feedback you would give. So I am going to walk through examples with you. I have not practiced this, but I really want this to be as kind of the best mimic of a raw conversation that we may have in class. So here's your informative feedback chart. Your first step will be to choose a sample assessment that you've already chosen, so either Artifact 2 or 3. Copy and paste that learning standard or objective that you had for that previous assessment right here. And then your challenge will be, well, what would it look like for a student to be below, approaching, and then meets or exceeds expectation for this specific standard? We'll then progress to looking at informative feedback that we could provide, and finally the appropriate instructional support in order to apply that feedback. So here's an example of an assessment I've had students use in the past. This is a parts of speech assessment. Straight off the internet, it's not a wonderful assessment, but it's fine. Again, these are not perfect examples, but just to kind of familiarize ourselves, we have matching, defining the different parts of speech, and then we're looking into selecting parts of speech amidst different sentence examples. So it's a decent assessment. Clearly up here, definitions, more lower order, and down here we have some more higher order objectives, or questions. So this is what the student first had and brought to class, and the student struggled to find the aligned learning objective, standard, and then write the aligned objective. So this is where she was working from. In fact, for her previous assignment, she had decided that she wanted to focus on, let me pull up Here we go. She wanted to focus here, which was when writing, show knowledge of the function of nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Now, that was it seemed to be very well aligned at first glance, right? If we go back to our assessment, all right, we're looking at different parts of speech. We're even looking at them within writing. So this was a fairly well aligned standard. One thing that is important to note is that disclaimer when writing, and actually in this assessment, the student is not writing. So she did have some definite analysis to do there, and I wanted to point that out to my listeners. But this is where she decided to focus. And again, it was not perfect, but this is what we had. So my first step is point A, and this was on your template, copy the learning objective or standard that you proposed your assessment could be used to address. Now, in the case that some of you chose to list more than one objective or standard, for the purpose of this exercise, I would just focus on one. So literally, I've copied and pasted this standard right here. When writing, show knowledge of the function of nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And I'm going to put it right here into my chart. Congratulations, there's step one. Okay, so then I'm going to take a really close look at my assessment. I've copied and pasted the standard right here for ease of analysis. So the next thing I want you to do is focus on your standard and literally get out a highlighter, or if you're working online like I am, then I want you to get some kind of tool where you can circle things. Go through carefully and circle each component of this assessment that clearly aligns to your objective or your standard. So, knowledge of the function of nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. All right, so I'm seeing all of these. Okay, don't want that. Let's change that. I'm seeing that this is definitely aligned to those first ones. But then I've got this issue, and I won't circle again for ease of just watching the video. Where do I see conjunctions or interjections in my standard? And the quick answer is I don't. So actually, I can't use that. So just to make this really obvious, I'm going to give us a big no, right? So I can't use that. It is not aligned. Now, it seems to be part of this assessment. That's great, but if using this exact standard, it's not aligned right now. So then I would go through and do the same thing for the rest of these assessment items. So Jenny ran toward the apple tree. Okay, this is a verb. Verb is within my standard, so I'm going to circle that one, and so on and so forth. Now, that's your first step. And if you don't do that step, then it will be very difficult to do your next step of defining below, approaching, and meets or exceeds. So let's say that this is actually becoming a pretty simple example. Just for ease of time, let's say I have a total of 10 questions. Now you have to ask yourself, okay, well, I had 10 questions. What does it mean to be approaching, meets, or below expectations? And I'm letting that awkward pause go on because we don't know, right? This is a very real part of assessment. Excuse me, there's some background noise going on. And I think it's really important that you guys realize there's not some magical number here. As the teacher, it is your responsibility to think, well, at this point, and for the purpose of my assessment, does meet mean, okay, they got maybe 9 or 10 questions correct? And maybe approach is 0 to 3 questions? and below, maybe approaching was 4 to 8 questions correct. Now, that feels really scary and feels very arbitrary, and it should. That's the purpose of this assignment. We want you to see how nebulous and confusing this gets, because that will help you see the importance of designing a really good assessment in the first place. Okay? You do not have to define this based on just how many answers that the students got correctly. You could also look at underlying conceptions. Remember, we talked about that when we looked at your midterm, if you are in Dr. Catalana's class, that is. You could look at trends. There are various ways that you can define this, but you have to, for this assignment, define below, approaching, and meets only based on this one assessment. So, yes, what if you've only circled one item? First off, that tells you your standard and your assessment are not aligned. If you can only circle one thing, they're not aligned. So there's your problem, right? And that's okay. You just need to complete the chart to the best of your ability. That does not mean you need to go back and redo things. It means, oh, now I have a lot to talk about in terms of analysis. Okay? So for part B, copy and paste your standard and look at it right in conjunction with your assessment. Go through, circle which items are correctly aligned, and then think about how you could define below, approaching, and meets or exceeds. It is important to realize this does not have to be number correct. I've had a lot of students, particularly with math assessments, look at the underlying mistakes, such as they categorize some as careless mistakes, some as, oh, they didn't understand decimals, or they didn't understand to find the common denominator. So look for underlying misconceptions, and that would be more informative. Okay, so moving back to our informative feedback chart. So again, here we've copied and pasted our standard. This part right here, definition based on your performance assessment, that will come from this circling activity, right? So you're going to copy and paste 0 to 3 questions answered correctly, right? Copy that into here, and that's going to be this first column right here. Now, let's look at part C. Provide examples of informative feedback that you can provide to students A, B, and C. Be sure that your feedback is specific and addresses both strengths and needs related to the standards/objectives being addressed. So this is your chance to practice what we have learned about informative feedback. So in this column right here, we literally want you to write what you would say or write on the student's work. So something to the effect of, great work this week. Remember, we're praising effort. Now I need to be really specific, right? And this is also where it comes to, how did I define below expectations? It's hard for me to be specific if I define below expectations simply by how many they got incorrect. But maybe they were below expectations because they only were able to understand nouns. So let's say, great work this week. Looks like you have a firm understanding of what a noun is. Now think about verbs, right? How would you explain verbs to a student? You wouldn't give the dictionary definition. I would probably say something to the effect of, think of things you can do, like run, sing, play. These are verbs, right? This is specific feedback. I'm giving specific feedback based to this standard or based to my learning objective. As I'm grading this, I should be able to read your feedback and say, I can directly see a correlation between the feedback and the standard. Okay, so I would keep writing here, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so informative feedback, this is literally what you would say or write on a student's work. Now, instructional support, if we think back to our formative assessment process, we want to provide instructional adjustment to help students apply this feedback, right? So it shouldn't be practice worksheets with verbs. Verbs. That sounds like extra work to me. And most likely you've already provided that. So your challenge is, what can I really do to support this student? They don't understand the importance of verbs. They are not quite sure what a verb is. What are some activities in class? What are some things that I can do to support that student in order to understand and apply my feedback? So I won't keep going because, again, every one of you will fill this chart out differently, and that is okay. We're not looking for perfection. We're looking for you to really be applying this material. Now, one thing to think about, the informative feedback that you give to approaching expectations and meets or exceeds expectations should be different. And I really don't want to see good job here because this is not informative. Even if your student has scored a 100%, they've met all of the objective, there is still more for them to learn. So we still want to be very specific in our feedback. And we definitely don't want to see extra worksheets here. We don't even want to see help struggling students here. Why? Because those students who are struggling most likely will not understand the quick ways that our more advanced students have developed to solve these problems. And also, a very advanced student, research has shown, sees teaching their fellow classmates as some form of punishment. So that's actually really not good practice. What are ways that you can continually challenge the students who may be a little ahead? So to summarize here, you are copying and pasting your standard based on when you circled the items and tried to figure out how to define below, approaching, and meets expectation. That's what's going here. Informative feedback is exactly what you would say to that student. We're not saying good job, right? This is not what we're looking for. Make it very specific and make it very clear. I can draw a line from this column to your objective right here. And lastly, your instructional support. What will you do in the classroom, or what other materials will you provide to help them apply your feedback? Finally, after you've completed the chart, these are your more open-ended discussion questions that you are more familiar with. So number 1, how would you deliver the feedback? Number 2, the relationship between effective feedback and standards and learning objectives. And lastly, asking you to apply informative feedback to your future classroom. I've had a few questions about the difference between guide instruction and determine impact on learning. Guiding instruction is asking yourself, what do I teach next? Where do I focus next? What do I do tomorrow? Determine impact on learning is a little bit more student-focused, and it's asking yourselves, is my instruction working, and what's my data to prove that? So did yesterday's lesson help Susie learn, and how do I know? And they do go hand in hand, but you want to make sure that you're working out how can you use informative feedback to help you make future instruction decisions, and also to constantly check yourself to ensure that your feedback and instruction is working. So there's your overall process. I realize this is getting a little bit long. I am going to walk through one other quick example just for clarity purposes, but much more quickly. So here is an Elements of Drama quiz. Again, the student found this online. So basically, there are no directions on how this works, but we have what seems to be some kind of definition, and I'm assuming that the students are filling in fictional people are the characters. The ending is going to be Not sure what the ending would be called. Can't see the answer. Resolution. So this is a drama quiz, particularly looking at elements of drama that one of my students in the past brought in. First step was for her to take the learning objective that she wrote in a previous assessment for that purpose of assessment artifact. She brought these standards in, and we had some trouble, right? So look at the anchor standard. I can create scenes and write scripts using story elements and structure. Now look back up at our quiz. This student does not have to create scenes or write script in this case. So standards weren't very well aligned. So we talked through this, and she ended up writing a pretty simple learning objective of, I can define basic elements of drama. Now, there are some issues with that, and I wanted to walk through what kind of issues we came up with, because you're likely to find these issues as you're working. So first things first, I'm literally copying and pasting my learning objective in. I can define basic elements of drama. I'm going to copy and paste that right here. And here's my quiz. So then I asked her, and this wasn't her as I worked through this example, based on your selective assessment, circle the items that are aligned. And this is where the problem came in. I can define basic elements of drama. We had no idea what she meant by basic elements of drama. So this produced a problem as she was going through the process of circling. What does that tell us? Most likely it tells us we need to rewrite this learning objective. That does not mean that she had to go back and change everything. But the beauty of this assignment is she had the ability to if she wished. What she did in this case is she wrote a more specific learning objective that included which elements of drama, and then we were able to follow through. Okay, so we defined below approaching meets. We put those definitions in right here. Then she discussed aligned feedback and the instructional support. So the reason that I wanted to give this presentation is I wanted to walk through some samples that weren't perfect and help you see that the purpose of this assignment is not to have a perfect end product, but to really think through the process of creating and crafting informative feedback. Of course, where the majority of your grade for the artifact analysis comes from will be more of these application and analysis questions, right? So you do want to be very careful when you are answering these questions to use your terminology, and particularly number 3, here's your chance to be hypothetical. You can pretend you have a perfect assessment to give formative feedback for number 3. But as you are creating your informative feedback chart, yes, do the very best that you can based on your ability to do so. It may be, however, that you're recognizing, I can't really define things in a very valid manner. And that's okay, because you're going to discuss that in either number 1 or number 2. You can say, I would deliver this feedback orally, but I would also encourage them to realize that this is only one assessment and that I've seen them perform in other ways, and I would triangulate my data and make sure that everything is telling the same story. So be hypothetical in your responses and do give yourself the chance to really follow up. It does not have to be perfect in the product. What we are looking for is your discussion and your analysis. Again, this was an overview of Artifact 4, the informative feedback chart. And if you have any questions, please be sure to contact your instructor.